Це Павло Жуков, який має власний стартап, який спеціалізується на темі ведення переговорів. Дуже корисно, що Павло, він прийшов на нашу конференцію не стільки зі сторони DEVOPS, скільки зі сторони розробки. І це важливо, тому що хороші інженери мають бачити обидві сторони медалі, і зручність використання взагалі репозиторіїв, вона більш важливіша для людей, які розробляють постійно. Отже, про досвід Павла наступні 45 хвилин. Раді вітати вас.
Спасибо. Презентация будет на английском, поэтому я переключаюсь на English. Okay, so my presentation is called Monorepo, or I am not afraid. It might sound silly, why can you be afraid of Monorepo, but let's take a look at this slide. This is statistics of Google using Monorepo in 2015. If you take a look at the number of files, they have over 1 billion. And the size of the content is enormous, 86 terabytes. How can anything be handled in such large amounts? It's impossible. And this is something to be afraid of, for sure. This is an example of a colossal monorepo, as many people call it. And probably you won't run into the same issues as Google, because I don't think many people work in such large companies. And how they deal with that large sizes is they just build custom source controls, because Git cannot possibly handle terabytes of data in one repo. And Google, Facebook, Twitter do it. And interesting thing is that they have pretty much all of their developers working through this one monorepo. Like Google, more than 25,000 developers, and 95% of their total engineers are basically committing stuff into one single repo. The way they manage it is they have a folder-specific authentication, and each person is responsible for maintaining a particular subfolder in a repo. So whenever you want to do a pull request into some other's folder, you do exactly that. You do a pull request not into a repo, but into a folder. And obviously it is very hard to manage, because you have to have a dedicated team of engineers full-time trying to wrap everything together. Let's get back to the more simpler use cases for Monorepo, using it for libraries. And it is especially useful if you run an open source library, which has pretty large code base. Let's say React or Babel or Vue.js or Webpack. All of them use it. And what's nice about it is you kind of keep with the library approach, you keep the pluses of separate repositories, and they still treat it as a separate packages completely. For example, here is how the Babel structure looks like. Inside the packages folder, you can see like Babel core, Babel code frame, etc. All of those are separate packages with their own versions. And you keep the versioning system. So basically, not versioning system, but you version your modules. Though there are specific tools which help you to do it, because obviously if you change, let's say, Babel core, and you want to update the whole library, you need to release everything. So you need to update a version in each of those sub-packages, which takes time if you do it by hand. So smart guys just created a bunch of tools to simplify it. One of those is learner.js. Maybe you heard of it, but this is not actually the main topic of what I'm going to talk about, so I'll just skip it. The interesting thing for us, for poor souls who just want to get things done, is micro-platform approach. This is when you want your application to be contained in a single repository so that many teams can collaborate together and work on it. And this is just this might end up as a simple refactoring step, which can be done within even a week. So you can use that approach for regular microservice-based projects, and what's interesting about it is that it doesn't require you to version any of your microservices. You develop against the so-called trunk. You do the trunk development, where you just work with your mainline code all the time. well, pretty much all the time, and you almost never branch out. This is the way that actually Google works, but on a very smaller, on a smaller scale. And you put all of your microservices which handle the API, the web, the native, the shared code, and the operations into this one repository. And after you spend some time to build the tooling around it, you can test, build, and deploy all of it together. So for example, a use case when you have 20 microservices and you build a new feature which somehow affects 3 of those microservices, you don't need to run 3 different deployment steps. All of this is handled by a single CI script or routine. And you can basically structure it however you want. This is a structure of our application, for example. You can see that we did the development initially in versions. Version 3 has some of the microservices. Version 4 has some of its own newer ones. Now, let's get to the question, how can you actually try it out? Imagine you have an application which consists of 5 microservices, and each microservice is written in a different language. You have C# guys doing the API on the back end. You have the front end guys doing React, probably. You have big data on Scala. You have machine learning in Python. And I think about DevOps as a microservice. That's why I listed it over here, because it helps when you think about it this way. Because usually the DevOps team is a team on its own. And while each of those other teams work on their own stuff, DevOps team also works on their stuff. So this is why this is also a microservice. And this is a very, very oversimplified diagram of how you move to Monorepo. You just Control-C, Control-V everything into Monorepo, and then the hard things begin. You set up the CI/CD pipeline and the tooling to manage this Monorepo. Well, it's actually very close to reality. The first step is really easy to do. OK, so let's go through the technical standpoints of why Monorepo is good or not. First of all the code is in one place, so you always have a single source of truth. You have a simplified dependency management. There are no problems with diamond dependencies, which is this thing. Let's say you have a microservice A, which uses microservice B and microservice C, and they use another microservice D. And whenever the microservice B is updated, it might use either a newer or older version of D. And you end up with having multiple versions of your microservice in the system, which makes it very hard to manage at some point in time to resolve those conflicts of dependencies. When you add a new microservice, you don't actually need to rebuild stuff from scratch. If you have, let's say, 10 C# microservices, adding 11th is going to be very easy if you are already on Monorepo. The refactoring is simplified because whenever you want to, for example, update a React library across all of your microservices for web, instead of doing this on a repo by repo basis, which will take an enormous effort to test all of it separately, you can just do it as a one branch called update React, which changes all of the microservices involved, which simplifies the testing and actual review of the code. One of the downsides, of course, is that code-based complexity increases. Now, since everything is in one place, it will take more mental effort to initially understand the structure of of your repository, understand where everything is and how it relates to everything else. And the end result is going to be that you are trained enough code repetitiveness of multi-repo with a greater polymorphism of monorepo. Even though it might sound contrary because you had many repositories which are kind of separate and independent from each other, whereas polymorphism, if you're putting all of this in one huge pile. But The good thing is that when everything is together and people start to create shared libraries, which are reused across other microservices, it actually provokes them to write more shared code. And the end result in the long term is that you have much better polymorphism because people just tend to work in a different way. They tend to share code much more compared to the way they were working previously. The atomic changes is the best thing about Monorepo. You can make large backward compatible changes easily. All the APIs can be deprecated or removed with confidence. And actually, it also includes the new APIs. So the way people usually work with monorepos is they don't do branches. Instead, they do features inside the code, the flag features, feature flags. So for example, when someone is working on adding a new payment system, they can just make all of the changes to the code in the main branch, in the master branch, and close it with an additional flag which you can change in runtime without doing the full rebuild. And there is no need for versions. So unlike the previous Monorepo use case for libraries, all your code is always actual. It's always being tested by unit tests, by the CI environment, etc. And you are sure that whenever you are changing something, it's going to work with all the other dependencies, with all the other microservices, if you change just one of them. Okay, the technical points are fine, but I think that it's more of an organizational change rather than technical. What's important is how it changes how people work with the code on a day-by-day basis. Let's get back to our previous example. And instead of repositories, what is usually companies end up with is a separate team managing either one or a bunch of repositories. So behind those repo A, repo B, repo C, there are actually actual people supporting them. And what we want from those people is to collaborate, to do awesome stuff together. So important thing is how it changes people's attitude regarding collaborating within and across teams. Now, when you do code reviews, you are always looking at what other people are doing. For example, like at my experience, there were no, it's very rare that whenever you implement something or fix it, you're changing only one microservice. Usually, it's backend guys and front-end guys and DevOps guys, all of them trying to fight who is responsible. And they try to push the problems from one team to another. This way, when you have everything in one place, people tend not to do it, so often, at least. Everyone can see what everyone else is doing, which is also very useful, because then they cannot only say that, oh, I'm only doing payments in C#, that's it. Screw you guys, I don't care about your code, I only care about what I'm doing. Extensive code sharing and reuse is going to become a standard if you move to Monorepo, because it encourages people to move things into reusable modules, because it's very, very easy to do. You don't need to publish anything. You don't need to create a separate repo. You just basically create a folder and include it. That's it. People start to care about what is going on. It's kind of related to what I already discussed, but more on this is, in the long term, Monorepo is going to simplify and speed up the development and communication between teams. And usually when you have many microservices, like sometimes I'm thinking that I would rather do some stuff myself, except of having like 10 people doing each thing separately. Because usually when one person does it, and he knows everything, he can do it pretty much the same time as 10 other people doing it separately, because they waste a lot of time on communication. So whenever you have more people, the more time is wasted on communication and responsibilities and figuring out who is responsible for what. Okay, so let's get to more practical steps. Again, very high level on how you can do it yourself. Let me get back to this thing. So like basically you copy pasted everything into one repo. You end up with a structure similar to this one, where each microservices is just located in a folder services in its own subfolder. Next step would be to set up the CI/CD. And this is the most complicated step, because obviously Control-C, Control-V should have went easy and fast. And you don't want to build everything whenever you push. So if you change the front end, you don't want to build C# and Python and everything else at the same time, because it's just waste of resources. So the very common tooling used for monorepos is diffin. Just figuring out what has changed. And in the simplest scenario, you just div the folders. You can do it with, for example, getting the SHA hash, or like using some library to do it. There are lots of CI/CD tools which actually support this kind of behavior out of the box. Like, well, I know of Sales CI, if you heard of it. Other open source CIs, I don't know, maybe not. And after you figure it out that a particular microservice did change, you just build and test and lint it, and you do it only for this microservice. You don't waste resources on running through any others which did not change at all. And deploy it. Let's say your feature changes 3 of those microservices. You end up building and testing, unit testing 3 of them. And then all 3 of them are being deployed as a one single step into your integration environment. Instead of what is usually happening with many multiple repos is you would build one, you would build second, you will build third, and then you have to have another meta step in your CI/CD, which will get those changed microservices and put them into a testing environment. The very, very final step, and sometimes it can get very complicated. For example, in our project, it took something like 2 months to move all the shared code from C# and JS outside. But it's definitely worth doing, because whenever you are working with this code and you support it, it will help you out a lot. So you just go with your developers through each microservice and you try to figure out what can be shared. It might be components, might be fixtures for your tests, might be your configuration for linting, for CI/CD, and the more you end up sharing, the better. Cost of software development basically is always present, and you just have to decide where do you want to pay it. Either it's going to be cost of managing repo and setting up the tooling for it, which is what you do for Monorepo, or cost of customization and deploying of the deployment pipeline, and wasting additional time for repeating things over and over again between repositories, like linting, using some CI/CD configurations, etc. That's it. Thank you. Yep, please.
How big is your repository? I mean, the 3 parameters, the size in megabytes, the amount of files, and the amount of lines.
That's a very
if it's not a secret, of course.
that's a very good question, and I don't actually counted it in a long time, so I don't know. But I can tell you an amount of microservices. On one of the largest ones, there are 30 microservices. Out of them, about 10 web, 15 on C#, and 5 others are machine learning, Scala, which handles the big data, and and DevOps configuration.
Okay, the next question is, where do you guys store your repository? Is it custom Git inside of your infrastructure, or it's GitHub or Bitbucket? What?
Yeah, that's a good question. So currently we do it in Azure, and we use Azure DevOps to automate all of it. Actually, very soon Azure is going to release a new kind of a Git implementation, which will handle very, very large monorepos. They are almost at the release date. But we don't actually use right now any of the Azure built-in things for monorepo. We just did the CI/CD pipeline ourselves. And it's currently very simple. It's basically just does defen of the folders on bash, figures out the unique hash of all the content in the folder, and just builds the Docker image and uses this hash as the Docker image tag.
So let me connect two my questions all together. You know, Bitbucket, for example, or GitHub, they are limiting you in size of the repository that they can hold. Say Bitbucket allows you to have 2 gigabytes, 2 giga per repository, and that's limit. How, regular developer and team can struggle without it, without using the external tools like Azure DevOps?
Well, you're probably talking about a very large monorepos like Google use, and that's not the case.
No.
Even like either GitHub or Bitbucket, they would be fine with even storing like a 2 gigabyte source code repository, and there won't be any problems with it.
Imagine you have several, let's say, thousands of branches, and that's why repository growing larger and larger.
Yeah, sure. If you have a large history, then it's going to be enormous. But, well, I don't know. Like I can only speak from my own personal experience. It wasn't a problem on any of the projects we did so far. Maybe they're not so large. Who knows? And definitely, when your project becomes very large, then you have to change your toolings. You have to move to yes, you have to move to something specific.
Hello. So could you articulate why, for instance, not using submodules? That's what we do. We have independent, small repository, and then if we really want to have something like this, we have a meta repository that includes other repositories as submodule. So I think that way we can get the best of both worlds, or what are we missing?
Sorry, you have a very wonderful French accent, but I didn't understand much. Can you please repeat
It's
again?
Italian accent. But I leave it there. Okay, so the question is, how about using Git submodules?
Okay.
So in that case, what we do, we have small, well-contained repositories for different modules in different languages. And then we have one meta repository that includes the other repository as, let's say, meta modules, okay? Or submodules.
Yeah, that's actually a very good approach. I saw that other people also do it, and that actually solves the problem which the previous person asked about. This way you can kind of, if you run into issues with GitHub, for example, this way you can just split everything into separate repos, but still keep the mother meta repo.
To duplicate all your infrastructure and initialize them every time, let alone like all the interesting pieces of working with Git submodules. It's not that the most pleasant experience as well.
Yeah, it is not.
So, and again, this is just a general discussion and debate whether to use monorepo or like one repo per component, which is a different discussion, like compared to how to organize monorepo. So, two different questions.
Right, and people tend to forget to pull a submodule, to push a submodule. That's a very common common
every
thing,
time
yeah.
and the
Update
rest.
it
And
every
again,
time.
what's the difference between including some modules and relying on some binaries if your language support relying
Yeah.
on binaries and package managers and the rest?
Mhm. Good point.
Thank you for your report. How do you manage permissions in your Monorepo? You have mentioned that Google use something like per directory permissions. Do you use something like this?
No, that will require you to set up a custom version source control system because Git does not support it. Well, maybe it does in some alpha versions, but I'm not even sure. So you would have to use either Facebook's or Google's source control systems implementation. And what we do right now, we just don't bother with that. We let everyone working on the project see the code. And we don't do monorepos for everything across the whole company. We have multiple projects which we are doing either ourselves as our startups or as an outsourcing for other firms. And we don't keep all the code together because obviously sometimes you have clients which are related to like federal government, right? And they obviously don't want to some particular pieces of the code to be shared with the people who they did not explicitly approved. So we only do monorepos on a project by project basis, on application by application basis.
Okay, and one more question. When do you store configuration information? I saw Helm subrepo, subdirectory. So I believe you store it in DEVOPS Helm.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
And probably you update the configuration right from your pipelines?
Yes,
Yes.
that's right.
And
Yeah,
that-
so yeah, that particular configuration is actually similar to what we have in a real project, just in real life we have much more microservices. But yeah, we treat Helm and Terraform configurations, and there is also Ansible and some bash scripts as a separate microservice because there is a separate team working on it of DevOps engineers. And many times whenever developers change something in the microservice, they need to tweak the code which deploys this microservice. For example, they added some environment variable for a secret key of authentication on Facebook, let's say, or like Google. Then this secret key needs to be somehow integrated into the DevOps microservice, kind of.
One more
And
question.
this makes it simpler because then whenever the developer does the pull request, like I add the Facebook authentication, this pull request can be reviewed by the DevOps guys too, not just the developers.
One more question, and this pretty easy. Isn't it a nightmare for your developers using this monorepo inside your, let's say, IDEA or other IDE which tries to index all of the repository
Yeah.
inside the memory?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, IDEA is can be painful. Yeah, IntelliJ IDEA is, well, if you set up all the plugins to support all the languages, then it's painful. But usually people use specific IDEs which are targeted at their specific language. So JS developers would use like WebStorm. Like C# developers would use probably like Microsoft Visual Code, etc. So it doesn't, I don't think it's a problem on like average size projects. But you have a point when the projects go large, then that might be very well a very big problem, yeah. Okay, no more questions? Okay, well, then thank you guys. And I'm going to be here. If anyone has any personal questions, I can answer them.